When I was in grade 12, I did her tax return, and I realized she had never made more than $14,000 a year in her life. I didn't even know we were that poor. I'm busier than I'd like to be, but I'm only doing things that I love to do. I can't tell you how many times I use ChatGPT in a week.
Yeah.
You know, I've had some really interesting uses of it. There's going to be some traps too. And my mother told me I could never tell her what to do until I had more education than she did. And she only had a grade 12.
Smart lady, yeah.
Let's bring in Grant White, portfolio manager,
an investment advisor.
Welcome to the Finding Your Wealth podcast. What this whole podcast is about is redefining the conversation around wealth. The whole thing is absolutely a bit of a tire fire, in my opinion. I don't like drama, and this stock is surrounded by drama.
Thanks so much, Greg, for joining me today. I think after our phone call that we had, our goal for this podcast is exactly up your alley, frankly, in the way you talk about like wealth and true wealth and what that really means. So I always like to start these episodes by asking you, how free do you feel today? Because true wealth in my mind is about freedom and the freedom to choose the life you want to live.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to know, how free do you feel today? And 10 being the most free, 1 feeling you're the most constrained. Where do you think you fit today?
Well, I'm certainly 10 out of 10. And I'd say that probably for a few reasons. Well, number one is we live in what I believe is the best country in the world, and it's a free democracy where we get to vote and choose and experience the freedoms that lots of people in the world don't have to experience. You know, from a second, I'm busier than I'd like to be, but I'm only doing things that I love to do.
Yeah.
So that's a sense of freedom as well.
Yeah.
And I guess finally, I've been fortunate enough in my life to accumulate enough possessions or enough, enough capital and enough income to be able to do what I want to do, but also to be able to contribute back to my community and to my family to help them out wherever they need help.
Right.
And that's a very satisfying way to be free.
Yeah. So I rarely get somebody who feels they're a 10 out of 10 in these conversations. And so I love that. I mean, when I think about myself today, I rank myself, I'm trying to do it daily, actually. But I probably put myself at around a 7, and my goal is to get to 10. I originally thought there's no chance, like I'm one of those people, nothing's ever perfect kind of thing. And so getting to a 10 is like a pipe dream, but actually you've inspired me that I can get to a 10. But I currently have myself at around a 7. And it's mostly because I think part of it for me is being able to choose, you know, how I spend my time on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And I think that just in the line of what I do and running businesses and so on, I don't always choose all the time and how I get to spend it. I think that's what I'm working towards, but I'm always inspired when I get somebody like you who can be like, I'm a 10.
Yeah.
And that's awesome.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question and this purely comes, and I did something this morning, just knowing that I was going to talk to you today, but did you weigh yourself this morning?
Yes, I did. I weigh myself every morning as soon as I get up. There's a few things I do every morning. I do the Wordle, and I do a Sudoku, and I weigh myself. That's provided I get up early enough. Those are the first 3 things that I do in the morning, and then I go on from there. But the reason I weigh myself is probably I believe in what gets measured gets done. Mm-hmm. And when I have a target weight, and when I get on the scale, if I'm a little bit up, then I say, okay, I've either got to exercise harder or eat less today, or a combination of both. Yeah. And if I'm down, I say, I can reward myself. I might be able to have a muffin or something extra today, or Well, I literally, so I hadn't weighed myself in a long time. Mm-hmm. I had been, so I ran the marathon back in June. And so I wasn't really concerned too much about weight leading up to the marathon because I know I was training pretty hard. So I hadn't weighed myself since. And then after our phone conversation, I decided to step on the scale. And lo and behold, I wasn't happy with where I was. That's right. So since then, I've been stepping on the scale more as that point of accountability, basically in the morning. So you've got so easy, especially at this age. As you get older, I read at one point that after the age of 50 or 40 or something, every decade you're going to gain 10 pounds. I said, no, I can't let that happen.
So I think for me, it's just like looking in the mirror, basically, and the accountability factor.
That's right.
But why do you think people struggle with that? I mean, I think this plays into this whole concept of like, establishing freedom as well. But why do you think people struggle so much with like looking in the mirror, stepping on the scale, and then having that picture in their head?
Well, because I guess if you're striving for truly be happy, you have to love yourself first. And if you don't love yourself, you really can't love anybody else or it's difficult to love others if you're not even happy or proud of yourself. So when I look at my own perspective on myself, I know what I want to look like, and so I try to. The older I get, the uglier I get, and I understand that too. But I think it's a sense of, if you want to love yourself, you have to start with, what do you want to look like, and how do you want to project yourself to the world?
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's something that we haven't covered off in too many of these conversations to date, anyway. But I think it's something that you reminded me of, is that we're often afraid to we're scared of what the scale is going to say. Yeah. We're scared of what the image is going to look like, or we're scared to put ourselves out there in some cases. And we were talking about Mark Chipman earlier offline here about like him putting himself out there in a speech this week. But I think it takes a little bit of bravery even to step on the scale every morning.
Right. Well, and we were away recently for 3 or 4 weeks, and I didn't get the chance to exercise as much, and I was eating what was put in front of me, and I gained 6 pounds, and I got back and I said, whoa, 6 pounds, that's too much.
Yeah.
It took me 4 weeks to get it back off.
Yeah. Well, so I think part of it is, looking in the mirror, looking in the scale, but the other part of it is, what do you do with that information afterwards?
Yeah.
How intentional are you afterwards, right? Before we get too deep into that, I do want to go back a step and just, again, with this whole concept that we're trying to get people to like really focus on the things that are more important in life. And I've been pretty adamant about the fact that like money's important. It's a vehicle, but it's not more than that. I mean, it is the vehicle to help you to achieve this freedom.
Exactly.
When you think about your freedom, and you've touched on a few things here, but what's your definition of freedom?
Well, freedom and happiness go hand in hand as far as I'm concerned, because you can't be happy unless you're free to make your own decisions, and some of your own decisions. And if you're free to make your own decisions, the chances are you're going to be happy. But in order to be happy, you have to cover Maslow's hierarchy of needs first. And that's where you come in. We were talking about wealth, and when you say the word wealth, lots of people, especially in the developed world or in Canada or North America, they immediately think of money. And yet wealth is an abundance of anything. It's not, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's an abundance of anything. It can be an abundance of talent. It can be an abundance of knowledge. It can be an abundance of assets or possessions. It can be more than just an abundance of money. But in order to be happy, you do have to be able to put food on the table. You've got to be able to cover your food and your lodging, or your food, your lodging, and the basics of life first.
You bring up something that I think it's very interesting, because I think a lot of people like fail to grasp that. And one of the things that you and I talked about it was in a phone call, was, we both known people that, like, there's people that have very high incomes, for example, that we both know through our own experiences that aren't happy.
Correct.
Lots of money, an abundance of money, but a lack of happiness. And at the same time, we've both known people that have what would be considered maybe lower incomes, but have an abundance of happiness.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think that is that is something, especially in North America, Canada, US, that is completely lost on a lot of people. And I don't know. I mean, I recently had a conversation with somebody about social media as an example. And I don't know if you partake on social media at all or not.
I try not to.
Yeah.
I usually try to stay away from it.
I'm not sure if social media is a net positive for the world, because, even just the other day, you and I are both at this fundraiser dinner, and somebody came up to me and says, Grant, like, you look like your life is perfect based on, like, he only knows me through Instagram, basically. And he says, you look like your life is perfect. You're the perfect dad. Da, da, da. And I'm like, you got to remember, you're only seeing the peaks. Like, you don't see the valleys, because nobody posts the valleys. I should post more of the valleys as well.
Well, that's right. That's what I think it's really, it seems as people become envious because everybody's posting all the best.
Yeah.
And here's me at my best, et cetera, et cetera. And they forget about the times that they aren't at their best, and then they say, well, I want to be like that, but I'm not like that, so they can go into a state of depression.
100%.
Drive them into a state of depression.
Well, like I said, I mean, like, I'm not sure. I mean, I love social media as a tool. I think it's brilliant.
Everything is an opportunity and a risk, there's opportunities there, and it's good, and they can be used for bad.
Yeah. I had this thought, and I think we're living in really interesting times, but I had this thought yesterday. I was listening to a podcast, and it kind of prompted this idea. It was talking about artificial intelligence, which is everywhere today, and everybody's talking about it and how it's changing our world.
Yeah.
I had this, it might be a bit spacey out there, but I think that actually the greatest innovation in the next few decades is actually going to be more about humanity than it is about artificial intelligence. And I think that because these tools, and whether it's social media or AI, are certainly elevating opportunities. But I think what we're going to have to get to is back to, like, what are the human experiences and how do we use these to enhance the human experience? And I think that actually is going to be our greatest innovation in the next few decades. I still haven't figured out what that's all going to look like.
But we're all playing with it, though, aren't we? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I use ChatGPT in a week. I've had some really interesting uses of it, and it's a terrific tool. You want to draft a speech, or you want to draft a letter or something, why not use ChatGPT as a first draft, and you can modify it. So there are some really good things, but I can think of sort of, there's going to be some traps too. And I sat in on a few webinars where they talk about the risks and the rewards and the opportunities and the threats.
I think I'm truthfully excited. I'm an optimist by nature, so I'm very optimistic about our future.
Yeah.
But I do think that we need to figure some of these things out, because I think people's freedom is at risk. I mean, I think social media is hurting people's level or perception of freedom, certainly. So I think there's things that we're going to work on. Given what you think of, like, your version of freedom, your definition of it, where did that come from?
Well, I think it came from a background. I was born in Saskatoon, but my father died when I was only 14 months old. He was killed in a serious train car accident. And my mother never chose to remarry. She, so my mother raised the two of us. And when I think of wealth, we didn't have, as a matter of fact, when I was in grade 12, I did her tax return, and I realized she'd never made more than $14,000 a year in her life. I didn't even know we were that poor. I didn't even know. And I thought, she'd send me when I was 9 or 10 years old, she'd send me to the grocery store, and she'd give me a certain amount of money and give me the list. And she says, now, if you have any money left over, you can buy one chocolate bar. So would I ever compare the prices, et cetera, and things? And so where did my sense of freedom come is that she was one of those people that you just spoke of. She was optimistic. She worked for Investors Group all her life as a secretary, et cetera. Yeah. But she was so optimistic in her life, and that reflected back on me. She was never, she could have. I remember one time when I got older, and I said, Mom, it must have been tough on you as an attractive woman back in those days. There must have been things that you experienced that weren't very good. And she said, Greg, she said, I could tell you stories that would make your hair curl, but she said, I never would. Yeah. And she was so positive and optimistic. So I thought, it's not money that makes you happy, because look how happy she is, and look at how happy she made us. Yeah. But she was an exceptional woman.
Yeah.
So I got carried away on that one.
No, not at all. I mean, these are the stories that we want to share, because I think that, some of the I think some of the people that understand happiness and this true wealth concept have gone through or have had circumstances similar to that, where it's like, I remember, I just remember actually, even as my wife and I were traveling, and we stayed on this, it was like a fruit plantation in the middle of Indonesia. And the long story short of this whole thing was there was a family there. I don't think I've ever met people that were happier. And they had literally nothing. I mean, the clothes that they're wearing, they had this plantation, which, provided them food. But they had no money. They had no definition, or they had nothing that we would define as like wealth typically here in Canada. But they're way happier than most people I know. And that really, like, that was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. That stuck with me, and I hope will always stick with me. That is more meaningful than anything I could ever buy, or for my family or whatever. And I think, from the sounds of it, your mom, I mean, she did a good job of just like, you didn't know you were poor, you were happy.
She always said to me, if you really need something and I think you need it too, she said, I'll figure out a way to pay for it.
Yeah.
She said, if you need it and I don't think you need it, you think you need it, you want it, and I don't think you need it, but I think it's not going to hurt you, then you figure out a way to earn half of it and I'll pay the other half. Yeah. Anything that you want and I don't think it's necessary, then you've got to figure out the way. So I always had to figure out a way to buy anything that I wanted to. So I had to work at a very early age.
So the definition, I mean, this is part of your core values. I think it's been obviously ingrained in you. Were you always intentional about achieving freedom in your life? Or
yes, very much. I always had a plan. Every time, well, I shouldn't say I always had a plan. I'd say that when I finished St. Paul's, and St. Paul's had a very positive experience for me because I was associated with a great group of friends, and we got along well together, and they tried to develop you. That's what their interest is, developing a man for others. And so I started volunteering at a very early age at St. Paul's. Way back when I graduated from St. Paul's in 1969, when Big Brothers first came here, I was one of the first Big Brothers. Right. I volunteered for the Canadian Mental Health Association at a very early stage, and things like that, where it was important. But I went into a first year of university not knowing what to do, and I was at University of Winnipeg, and I wasted. I was partying too much. I was not. I was playing pool in the basement of that hotel over there, and wasting time. And I thought, no, this isn't good. Let's have a reset here.
Yeah.
So I worked hard for several months. Worked for Ford Motor Company in their parts department.
Okay.
And saved every cent I could save, and then I took off to Europe for as long as my money would last. I had a book called Frommer's Europe on $5 a day.
Okay.
And I tried to stick to $5 a day when I was in Europe, staying in youth hostels, sometimes sleeping on the street.
Really?
Yeah.
Holy smokes.
And so I was 5 months there, and one time I took a room in top of a boarding house in one of the, I think it was in Munich, Germany.
Okay.
And I went up there, and for 2 days, all I did is write poetry. I went out for meals, and I went to the pub, but for 2 days, all I did was write poetry. So anyway, when I came back, I said, okay, I've got to have a plan for my life.
Yeah.
And I said, I want to have more money than my mother had. And so I've got to learn something about finances and everything. So I applied for the Royal Bank, and I went to work for the Royal Bank for a while.
Okay.
And I worked with them for a year. And then I said, I want to go back to school. I want to learn more about finance. So I took a commerce degree, and then I took chartered accountancy, because I thought, well, if I get an accounting degree, I'll always have a job.
Yeah.
Because every business needs an accountant.
Yeah.
And so then that's how I got on to the point where, and my mother told me I could never tell her what to do until I had more education than she did. And she only had a grade 12.
Smart lady. Yeah.
So I got those things, and I said, okay, now I can start working on a solid financial foundation. So I've got a positive outlook on life. I've got a reliable source of love in my life. I've got the things that matter to me in my heart. Now I got to say, how am I going to be able to establish the freedom to do the things I want to do and give back to those who need it, give back to my family and others, other worthy causes that I think are necessary.
So I know you mentor a lot of people and have mentored many people over the years. What's your process like, or what's your mindset around like goals around these things, setting goals?
That's really a good point, because I look at, there's three parts to your life. There's the learning stage, there's the earning stage, and there's the returning stage. And so I always have to have a plan after I finished university. And I said, okay, in the learning stage, you're not only learning from books and academics, but you're learning your own skill sets. What are my skill sets, and how can I apply those, and how can I own those skill sets? All a learning aspect of things. Mm-hmm. And then when you move into the earning stage and you say, okay, what's my plan for my earning stage? Where do I said I wanted to be in the financial services industry, for example. Yeah. And I said, okay, now here in Winnipeg, I didn't want to go east of the Manitoba-Ontario border. And the Royal Bank wanted to move me to Toronto. And I said, no, I don't go there. So I said, where are the financial industries that have a head office here? Well, it was Richardson Financial. Yeah. And then there was Investors Group, there was Great West Life, and there was Wawanesa. Yeah. And so I said, one of those I want to go to. And it so happened that Wawanesa came along with a job that matched my skill set, and I went there and flourished. So I wound up being the president and CEO for 15 years before I retired.
Right.
So that was the plan for the earning part. Yeah. And then, and these are not mutually exclusive. The learning they blend together as a whole. But then in the returning part, I said, okay, now I had been chair of the Winnipeg Foundation, and I had been the chair of the United Way campaign, and I saw that Indigenous people were overrepresented in too many parts of our society. And so how could I help that? How could I come? And I got some real good advice from Murray Sinclair. I got some really good advice from our former Prime Minister, Paul Martin. And I said, okay, my plan is here to start my own reconciliation journey and help wherever I can that whole reconciliation to take place in our community. What can I do about it? And so I had started making friends with, I'd never had, prior to that time, I had never had an Indigenous friend. I had never had a friend an Indigenous person over to my house for dinner. I started having dinner parties and inviting Indigenous couples over to our house for dinner. I started making friends, reaching out. I reached out to Wab Kinew when he was, before he was even in politics, and I felt he was a really interesting guy who had a terrific career path in front of him. Yeah. And lo and behold, he's doing wonderful things as our premier.
Yeah, absolutely. I recently had a conversation. I mean, so I have to say, Premier Kinew, Wab, is one of the best speakers. I mean, we go to all these fundraising events. You go to all these fundraising events. Yeah. And, there's always the premier at the time will always show up. He's the only one I ever see that I actually look forward to. Exactly. What he has to say. Goes up there without any notes. Yeah. And he's just a fantastic speaker. But, I remember I was chatting with, I think a friend of yours, Nick Logan.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I was chatting with Nick, and I think the story is, I might misquote Nick here, but I'll tell the story anyway. Nick said that, Wab Kinew was canvassing in the area at the time. And so he came up to Nick's house, and Nick said to him, he's like, oh, like, he's like, I'll hear you out, but you're gonna have a tough time on me getting my vote, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then after about 15 minutes, he's like, he's earned my vote for life after that.
I'll tell you. He talks about inclusive things, and he talks about, and he also doesn't talk too long. He's focused on quality, not quantity.
Yes.
When he speaks, and he talks about us as Manitobans, us as Canadians, and he cooperates. And instead of fighting with the other levels of government, he seems to be cooperating with the other levels of government.
That's exactly what you want.
Exactly.
From a leader in that role.
Yeah. So that was the plan. Is my plan. I had a reconciliation plan. I had a plan. I had a plan for my education. I had a plan for my business career, and I had a plan for my retirement. Long before I had a list of 20 things that I was adding to before I retired that were part of my plan for retirement.
Did you learn that from your mom, or did you have?
No, I don't think so. I think I learned that from other people along the way.
Who were your other mentors along the way?
Well, let's see. One that was a good mentor in high school was George Dawson. He was one of the teachers at St. Paul's.
I had George,
and he really turned me on to mathematics. And he was also, I lost a dear friend to suicide just in my when I graduated from university, and George reached out to me and really gave me a lot of comfort and a lot of advice, etc. So I always looked up to him. And then there were two men. One was Andy Jackson, and Andy Jackson worked for Investors Group, where my mom had worked. And he always said, one of the things that he always stuck with me, he says, you know what, as you go through your business career, just remember to do this. Everybody is a person. And he said, you should treat the person who's the janitor in your building the same way you treat the chair of the board. Don't treat them differently. And I thought, wow, that's really a good. So that's what I tried to, do in my when I was at Wawanesa, for example. At Christmas time, I'd go around and I'd start in the basement with the janitor and the people who were looking after our building. And I'd shake their hand and thank them for what they did that year. And then I'd move up through the building thanking, but I'd try and treat them all the same. Then the third person was a man who worked for Canadian Indemnity, which was another insurance company. And I'd go out for lunch with him, and he'd give me some good ideas and some good advice on my career path.
So your time at Wawanesa, because how long were you there? You were in leadership for
15 years and 13 years before that, so 28 years.
Did you know when you went there, in the beginning, did you know that you were going to lead the company?
Well, I knew I had a really good chance, because I'll tell you why. I went there and I looked around and I said, all the guys who I interviewed with, here's, let's see, that was in 1979. So I was then 28 years old at that time. And I said, okay, there's an awful lot of gray hairs here. Well, everybody in these chairs all have gray hair.
Yeah.
And I'm coming in just under the next level down from some of these guys. And I think I can make an impression.
Yeah.
And I also had a higher level of education than some of those leaders. And I said, boy, oh boy, this looks like a pretty good place. And so I came in, and then I had and then I won't get into all the details, but when I got promoted, and then they wanted to transfer me down, because I started learning how to use the computer as soon as they came out.
Yeah.
And in the early 80s. And I had an Apple IIe, and I was creating programs on the Apple IIe, and I showed them how I could calculate the premium for an insurance policy on my computer. And they said, holy cats, you can do that? And I said, yeah. So then they transferred me down to California, and I was supposed to be helping them take all all the records and everything from manual to a computerized system. And
Okay.
So before they transferred me, I said, okay, I'll go down there, and I said, I'll do this job. But I said, I want you to assure me that in 3 to 5 years, I'll come back to head office, because I said, this is where I want to be.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, we'll assure you that you'll be back here in 3 to 5 years. And almost 3 years to the day, they called me back to another position. And then I said to the president at the time, I said, I'll work my butt off. I'll do everything you want me to do to the best of my ability. And if you don't think I'm doing a good job, you tell me. And if I agree with you, I'll adjust myself. If I don't agree with you, I'll quit and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And but I say, I want a chance at your job. When I don't, you can't promise me anything, but I want a chance at your job. And if we're at a common mind, then good. So
yeah, that's great. Do you think? And again, I know that you play an active role in mentoring and a number of like professionals and business owners in the city here. Do you see that intentionality in a lot of people, or do you think that's?
I'd say not in a lot, but in some. Some, it's sort of like, it's sort of like if you think of an analogy in sports. This is a good analogy. I've discussed this with Sandy Riley, a good friend who was in a couple of Olympics himself.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was in sailing in the Olympics twice.
Oh, wow.
So when most of us in life, in whatever endeavor we're dealing with, we get to a point and we say, that's good enough.
Yeah.
Where you're playing a sport, you get to a B player in squash and you say, that's good enough. It's different levels for everybody. You get to satisfactory wealth level. Yeah. Some people say that's good enough. Some people say it's never good enough. Well, the people who say it's never good enough, I think it's kind of hard to ever get to the top of the hill.
I'm in that camp right now, I would say. I'm trying to learn how to be like acceptable, or accepting the fact that it's like, it's always the journey. It's always continuing, always pushing for more. But anyway, yeah.
So don't know where we were going with that, but it's another.
It reminds me. I just had this conversation at lunch today, though, because a good friend of mine, he's an architect, and what was he saying? Oh, he kept talking about the destination. He's like, He's like, I'm working towards this, and that'll be the destination. He said that multiple times, and I said, in my mind, the destination is actually death. It's the end.
That's right.
I'm like, so you have to learn to love the journey along the way, because that's actually life.
Right.
And he's like, oh, yeah, I've never really thought about it like that. I'm like, yeah, because like as soon as you get to one thing, I mean, there's another checkpoint down the road that you keep pushing towards. So
I'm not contradicting that. I'm just saying that, in various aspects of your life, there's some things that you may never be satisfied with, but there's other parts of your life you can't be great at everything, let's put it that way.
No.
And so you're going to be satisfied with certain levels of your life, like we talked about before. Some people are very happy and they don't have that much, and some people are.
So you've talked a little bit about giving back, and I know the community is incredibly important to you, and I want to know a little bit more about what that means to you, and what part of giving back to the community, like what role does that play in your freedom? And you talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs before too, but what I wanted to say was like, what percentage, or how important is that to you? And
it's really important. I think to those, there's a saying that to those much is given, much is expected, or much is returned. And I think that we all have an obligation. So my wife and I sit down at the beginning of every year, for example, and we say, okay, we've got a healthy income. And so let's take 20% of our total income, and that's our budget for generosity, for philanthropy in a year. So then we target that, and we think that financially is what we're going to give to the community. And then on the other hand, we say, okay, but we've got to be doing something too. Money is one thing, time is another. And I have some talents. I heard somebody say one time, they said, Oh, now I'm old enough that I have all the answers, but nobody asks me the questions anymore.
Yeah, right.
They don't care about my answers. Well, I feel that there's a balance between knowledge and wisdom, and I can offer advice to some people. And fortunately, I have quite a few who come to me and say, "Well, what would you do in this situation?" or "How would you have you ever had this?" and how would you handle that? Or sometimes they take my advice, sometimes they don't. So.
How do you go about choosing which organizations? And you don't have to name the organization you don't want to, but like, how do you go about choosing?
Well, what I'm focused on really is improving outcomes for children and families, because I say, okay, there's a lot of people hurting in the world today, but the future is children. And we have too many children living in poverty. We have too many children living
even in our own city
here. And we really have to say, I mean, the phrase is overworked, but every child matters. Every single child matters.
Yeah.
We can't have them if they don't have a sense of belonging and a reliable source of love in their life, then they're going to get into mischief and do bad things, and they'll be on the wrong path. And so I think I am concentrating my efforts, everything that I look at for my own. When I'm talking about financial giving, it's a broad spectrum. There's probably 70 different organizations that we make a donation, at least 70 that we make a donation to every year, some more than others, obviously. But when I look at my own investment of time, it has to have something to do with children from pregnancy to preschool. That's where I have to invest my time and my efforts, personally.
So this reminds me of, so Indra Nooyi, former CEO of PepsiCo, was in town a few years ago. Except I
remember her.
Yeah, and
I read part of her book.
Yeah, same here. Actually, I should read the rest. She spoke about work that when she was still leading Pepsi, she spoke about work that they were doing in communities in India where they had production plants and what they were doing. And she spoke about the partnership that needed to exist between government and the private sector in order to get things done. And I'm curious on your views on that, given that you've been involved, at the highest levels of the private sector. You've been involved and worked with and probably even mentored politicians and political leaders, and of course in the community organizations as well. What role do you think those three pillars need to play together?
I guess sometimes I get frustrated with levels of government because they can't move as fast. They're so tied up in policies and procedures and regulations that have been built up over time in the systems, that the systems are just in a state of a solid state, and they're not flexible enough to move quickly. I could give you lots of examples of that, but I don't want to do that in public.
Of course.
But then, so I think it has to. Some of our government money, our taxes, have to go to support these organizations. Take a look at, you and I both know the United Way. Yeah. If government didn't help the United Way in the way they do, provincial government didn't help, all of those 100 and some agencies that are out there doing great work in our community and are vetted every year by the United Way to ensure that they're adding value to our community, all of those needs would still exist. So now, if the United Way didn't exist, those would have to all be covered in our taxes because they'd have to be picked up somewhere else.
Yeah.
So it's good when you can have that partnership between, organizations working in the community, government, and philanthropists who will donate to the organizations. The other thing that's a little bit frustrating, though, from time to time, is we have so many nonprofit organizations that overlap each other. They're all doing good things, but they overlap each other, and you kind of wish it could be like the private sector, that you could buy out. You could have takeovers of these organizations when their mission statements are almost identical.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they each have an executive director, they each have a development officer, they each have an executive assistant to answer the phones, etc. And wouldn't there be a better way if you could have amalgamations and
I don't know how you solve that problem.
You don't. It's hard. I've got a couple of war stories where I've got some scars from trying to do it.
That's the thing. I mean, everybody's protecting their own fiefdoms,
that's right.
in some cases.
Yeah.
What responsibility do you think the private sector has to play in the community?
Well, I think the private sector has a big, both if you say corporations and individuals. I think that, and people are recognizing that. The employees are recognizing that. They expect, they want to work for an organization that has social responsibility.
Yeah.
And you see that all the time. You're turning around now, or individuals will pick a corporation to go and work for because they know they're giving back to the community. And so I think that, they have a significant responsibility, and those that don't, I think, are missing the boat.
Yeah. I want to get back to your family a little bit, because I know how, you have a wonderful family. I'm lucky enough to know a bunch of them. What role does your family does that play in your freedom? And
that's a great question.
Yeah.
And I guess always in my life since the day I was married, my family was always number one for me. My job or my source of income to support my family was number two, and everything else came after that, including my volunteer time and other interests, exercise, and all that kind of thing. And I'm so blessed because I found my sweetheart, and the woman I love her more. We just celebrated our 47th anniversary, and I love her more today than I did when I married her. And the love just continues to grow between us. And we often talk about it. People talk about, I don't think, I might be wrong, and she might say differently, but I don't think that she and I have had 10 arguments in our 47 years.
Is that right?
I mean, it's incredible how we can also always come to we hardly ever even, maybe we're too much alike or too much different. I don't know what it is, but we hardly ever even disagree.
Yeah.
But if we do, we can always come to a consensus and say, so first of all, I was fortunate enough to find my soulmate the first time around, and I love her and she loves me. I tell her 5 times a day, from the time I wake up in the morning and the last time I do, saying before I close my eyes at night, I say, I love you, Mary.
Yeah.
And my kids, we engulfed them in love as they were growing up. And, there's some difficult times with kids, especially through their teenage years, but they all always knew they had a reliable source of love, and they're both grown up to be certainly contributing citizens that I'm proud of, for sure. And now our grandchildren, I've got the benefit. They say that grandchildren are the reward you get for having children in the first place, and that's right.
Well, I can attest to the fact that you're very lucky because your family, Mary, is a wonderful woman, and your kids are fantastic as well. Yeah. On the phone, you said to me that you feel guilty about how happy you are sometimes.
I do. I honestly do, because, I wake up in the morning and I say, can I think of, there's so many people struggling and so many people unhappy in the world, and can I do anything more than what I'm doing? What can I do to help other people? Because I just don't have very many problems. And I can honestly say, I don't think I've had some sad times in my life when my mother died. I thought I was going to. I thought that was going to be the end of the world. She was so wonderful to me. And my grandmother, too, was terrific. I've had sad times of losing one of my best friends who committed suicide. Yeah. But I've never had any days of just depression, or maybe a little bit of not feeling as good as I did the day before, but no days of any kind of depression or anything. So I feel guilty about that too. People talk about mental health these days, and it's real, and I'm glad it's out there, and I'm glad we're dealing with it, but it's hard for me to relate to it because personally I relate to it in others, and I'm very, very supportive of people who have some mental issues that they're dealing with, but I just don't seem to have any of those.
With that, what's your hope for your family for the future?
Well, my hope for the family is that they can grow up in a world that will straighten itself out on some of the challenges that we have in this world. Because today, I don't like to see wars going on. I mean, think of Zelensky in Ukraine, what he's dealing with. Think of the Middle East, the issues that are arising there.
Yeah.
I hope. There's always been difficulties in the world. We had two world wars in the last century that people had to deal with, and we always think we're dealing with the worst things. But I hope that we can, my family and my kids and my grandkids can grow up in a world where we can overcome some of the bad challenges that are out there, and we can evolve into another cycle of good.
Yeah. Are you optimistic about that?
I am. I guess I'm an eternal. You said you were an optimist. I'm an eternal optimist.
Yeah.
And I believe we will overcome. I think that human ingenuity, we can never doubt the strength of human ingenuity. And will we deal with things like, the big things like AI, climate change, just wars in different areas, hate. We got to put more love back into the world and less hate. There's just too many people who hate each other. And the only thing I hate is I hate the word hate.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter who you are. Don't we all agree? It doesn't matter what religion you belong to or anything else. We all believe that we should love our neighbor. And isn't our neighbor everyone?
Yeah.
It's not a neighbor. And it's not just the guy next door to you. It's your neighbor's everyone. So we've just got to try to exude that love for each other. And
I think such a good example. I mean, you were talking about your journey in reconciliation before. I mean, I think that's one of the best examples of the people that have engaged in it. And I know that again, that dinner the other night, we're at True North and Mark Chipman talking about his journey and True North's journey in reconciliation. And I was amazed at the stories, and I think that anyway, that is one of the best examples of inspiring people to come together versus the divisions that could divide us completely. And you're right, the world is full of them. Like you, I'm optimistic. I think that the spirit of ingenuity in people is we can solve any problem. We just need to have.
And I hope that we can encourage good people into leadership, because right now, it doesn't matter what kind of a leadership position you're talking about. People kind of shy away from it because they don't want their life to be in a spotlight. They don't want. I mean, politicians, when I was growing up, I mean, they had high level of respect and everything. And now we're trying to tear them down every time they step into the arena. We're trying to find their faults. And don't we all have faults and we all have some things that we did in their past that we're not proud of?
Well, I think you're right. I think we need to get away from that.
That's right.
That conversation. You look at debates in the past and how respectful they were compared to debates that happen on today. And they're just like, I recently spoke with somebody who ran for office here in Manitoba, and he's a business owner. And he said to me, he's just like, I'll never do that again. He's like, he didn't win. He's like, I'll never do that again. He's like, these people tore my business apart, and all I tried to do was be helpful. We might not have the same viewpoints on how we want to get there, but we often have the same goals in mind. So in any case, I agree. It hasn't become, politics isn't glamorous anymore.
No, that's right. And yet we've got to, if we want good government, we have to have good leaders. If we want good companies, we've got to have good leaders.
Yeah, I agree. So, just in closing, again, I know mentorship is really important to you.
Yeah.
what advice would you give to our listeners today? Again, just as an overarching, as we think about what true wealth really is here, what advice would you give to people listening?
Well, I'd say pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, that's ensconced in the U.S. Constitution, but we all have a right to life, liberty, which is freedom, right? Yeah. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'd say, you have those rights. Make sure that you bring those rights to bear, and that you move on with your life in trying to have a wealth of all three of them. Liberty and pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, I love that. And I'll give you the last word, of course. Is there anything else you'd share with people that you think would be important, or any resources you'd share with them that could help them along their own journey?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things we talked about too was what you read and what you seek. There was one book that I read at the right time in my life, and it was called "It Doesn't Take a Hero." And if you're talking about leadership, it was written by Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the leader of the he was a general in the U.S. Army that led the Desert Storm activity in that Desert Storm. And it was such an enlightening book, because this guy came from humble beginnings, raised to be a general. And when he had his 800,000 troops over there in Iraq, he treated them all with respect. And you had 800,000. That's why that was so effective. It was timed. They went in, they did the job, they had a clear mission, they did the job they had to do. And because of his leadership, every one of those 800 guys would lay down their life for that guy, because he was such a strong leader. And so that was a very good book that I read. That another one that was a damning book was called Barbarians at the Gate.
Oh, yeah.
And that book showed the worst part of the 1980s, the Wall Street and the state of U.S. capitalism. It was a real negative. So one was a positive, and the other was, can that really be true?
Yeah, right.
And then three of the thought leaders in the world today that I really think are terrific is Thomas Friedman. I love the books he's written. He has such insight into the world, and I've read 2 or 3 of his books. As a matter of fact, Adam and I listened to one of them. Doesn't take. Sorry for Being Late, I think.
Okay, yeah.
We listened to it driving back from California. Okay. Both of us were just glued to it. Thomas Friedman, and then Backlash Schmiel, who was at the University of Manitoba. He's got some tremendous books on today's environment. One's called Numbers Don't Lie, and I think he's written about 30 books, but he is a brilliant, brilliant man. And the third one is Bill Gates. Bill Gates thinks Backlash Schmiel is his favorite author.
I've heard that, actually,
And I've read Bill Gates' book too, or he's probably written more than one, but I've read at least one of his. And so those are 3 of the thought leaders in the world that I think sure make things make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think it ties into, I think people need to always be curious, and people need to, continue to have that learning mindset throughout their lifetime.
Lifelong learning. Never give up on learning. I always have 3 books on the go. I have one that's an audio book that I listen to coming downtown or going back. I have one that's on my iPad that I read when I'm just sitting down and I don't want to look on a little wee screen, and I read. Yeah. And then I have one by my bedside. And right now I'm reading, I've read lots of the stories about Winnipeg businessmen, like Richard Croft. He wrote a book on Byron, and then Bill Parrish wrote a book. Laurie Pollard had a book written. Yeah. Those are past business leaders in the community. And right now I'm reading the Princess Otto story.
Oh, interesting.
About the Tallman family.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting book. You're always going to get some nuggets of wisdom in those things. Awesome.
Well, Gregg, thank you so much again for joining me today. I appreciate it. And I know our listeners are going to love it. Just thanks so much again for sharing all this.
Well, thank you.
We're asking the questions too, so don't worry. You haven't outgrown us yet.
Okay.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.